My name is Wesley Scott. I am a workshop coordinator and resolution health support worker with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. And our organization works primarily out of British Columbia. I'm coming to you today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations here in Vancouver. Our organization has a 25-year history of providing emotional and cultural support to Indigenous peoples. And in addition to supporting residential school survivors and intergenerational survivors and their families in British Columbia, we also monitor and maintain a 24-hour crisis line in addition to the national crisis line. And we have a variety of different programming regarding culture and youth programming and elder programming. And I am so thrilled that we get to share this information with you today and talk a bit about the history and impacts of Indian residential schools. So our objectives as an organization is to provide holistically empowered care and support in a physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional sense to residential school survivors, to the Indigenous community, and to promote awareness of the history and impacts of Indian residential schools. And so we have offices throughout British Columbia where our workers will provide one-to-one support or develop community events in regional circumstances, as well as offer ceremony or traditional knowledge to communities as well. And so this process began as an extension of the First Nations Summit. We are an independent nonprofit organization providing health services. So we've been supporting survivors for 25 years, as I said, as their experiences continue and Canada's knowledge of the experiences of Indian residential school survivors increases. So we were a big part in providing support at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we've been a big part in supporting survivors as they approach the government in class actions, and we've been there beside survivors as they deal with recent news announcements, such as the ones out of Kamloops. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for instance, estimates that somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 students died at these institutions. And so this has been triggering for a lot of survivors. And so we've been providing support to them as well as to the community in general through our crisis line and through independent support. The history of residential schools is a tough one to grasp without context. At the time of the settlement within Canada from a European colonialist perspective, at first Indigenous people were treated with equality. The Royal Proclamation, 1763, this acknowledged that Aboriginal title exists and continues to exist unless ceded by treaty. But by the time we hit Confederation in Canada, with 1867, the British North America Act, we see that the attitude of trading and governing parties towards Indigenous people has shifted their attitude to ones where Indigenous people were more treated like a problem to be controlled, as wards of the crown that needed to be kept in guidance and protection. And so this is something that is very different as we see it through history, this change in perspective towards Indigenous people and the lands Indigenous people occupied. And so with the development of Canada, we see figures like Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, emerge and utilize language and commission reports that contribute to this institutional system of assimilation and oppression. So, these are quotes from Sir John A. Macdonald. we have been pampering and coaxing the Indians that we must take a new course, we must vindicate the position of the white man, we must teach the Indians what law is. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. This isn't the language used by someone who recognizes indigenous people as equals, but so much as a force to control. And so we see at this time, the introduction of aggressive assimilation policies. And so with the commission of the Nicholas Flood Davin report in 1879, which was a report on the workings of industrial schools in the United States and their advisability of establishing similar institutions in the Northwest Territories of the Dominion. So the most effective means of civilizing Indian populations in Canada was to take children away from their homes, separate them from their perceived negative influences, and that adults were deemed too cumbersome to change, that they could be indoctrinated into learning English and French and Christian instruction. And so these were the type of models that were introduced. And, these institutions took 150,000 children from their homes, forcibly, from their families, from their communities, either RCMP or clergy members or Indian agents or even parents out of fear would take their children to these institutions, either sometimes a little ways from their community or provinces away. And, these children would be separated from their primary sources of growth and education, their parents. And so we have this system where this would have not only a lasting psychological impact from that act alone, but these institutions were abusive and neglectful. There are many instances of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse that have been documented. But as well, there's malnourishment and intentional or rampant exposure to diseases such as tuberculosis. And these are just some of the conditions that were experienced at residential school. And the last residential school closed in 1996. That's only 25 years ago. It's such a multifaceted question. I can't speak for the experience of all survivors. I'm a first-generation Canadian, but this hits home in the sense that they took kids 4, 5, and 6 years old away from their family. That would have been the prime age my sister would have been in 1996, and so this is something that is relevant to almost all Indigenous people. And so and not only to say that these conditions existed, but that they're a matter of record as well. Dr. Peter Bryce, who was the general medical superintendent for the Department of Indian Affairs in 1907, wrote a report that said that the mortality rate at these schools ranged from 30 to 60% over a period of 5 years. His findings didn't become public until the 1920s when he was forced into retirement. But the conditions at these schools, from my experience working directly with survivors to provide emotional support or to hear their testimonies or to share it with people in the community, from what I've heard from survivors, these conditions were neglectful. They weren't instilled with a sense of self-worth. They were told that their traditions, their culture, their language were wrong, that they were punished for speaking their language. And the conditions they were facing were ones of survival. And so this is very different from a classic boarding school where there's education or learning or safety. Kids were trying to survive residential school. They were struggling. They were being abused and neglected. And so, these have impacts. So when we talk about the impacts of residential school, we're talking about the way it manifests in people's lives, be it through inappropriate coping mechanisms such as drugs and alcohol, or entirely preventable mental health conditions for subsequent generations like fetal alcohol syndrome or NAS, or normalized patterns of violence, a lack of self-worth, dysfunctional family relationships, diminished parenting skills, higher prevalency of things like teen pregnancy, suicide, depression, poverty, spiritual confusion, disconnection from the natural world. If someone is told their traditions, their way of life, their being, their language is wrong, and that it should be replaced with something else, and the people who are trying to replace it with something are in many cases abusers, we're finding that there is a very much a difficulty, a disconnection, dissatisfaction with values, and so it's hard to reconcile things. So this has an impact not only on survivors of residential schools, but intergenerational impacts. So according to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, when someone experiences or witnesses a traumatic experience and that experience is not dealt with, those effects are passed on to the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Aboriginal people who attended the residential school system. And so in this sense, we can see the impacts of residential school not only manifest for survivors, but their children, intergenerational survivors. And, this is not to say everyone's experience is the same, but just that these impacts are prevalent and a matter of record. Fantastic question. And it's a question we've been getting a fair amount. People want to help, they want to contribute. And so, you're taking first strides here. You're learning about the history and impacts of Indian residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented 94 recommendations that people can consider, including some very corporate specific ones. Contacting your MPs and local officials and letting them know that Indigenous supports or Indigenous rights are important to you and your community. Taking the time to actively listen to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, especially when they're willing to share their stories, being respectful towards trauma survivors and elders, that's really important. But standing up to stereotype, prejudice, and systemic racism is a big part of it too. I recall two instances, Joyce Echequan, who died in hospital care only a year ago, after experiencing significant systemic racism and neglect in the hospital care system. I also recall a fellow by the name of Maxwell Johnson, a Heidsick gentleman who came down from Bella Bella to Vancouver and wanted to open a savings account for his granddaughter, and just out of suspicion was placed in handcuffs. These are just two instances in recent history that impact Indigenous people. And so, keeping this in mind and standing up to that sort of prejudice is important. And, I think the last things, of course, are twofold, is, taking the time to support Indigenous-led organizations in your community. There are friendship centers across the country. And, taking the time to raise awareness, commemorating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation or Indigenous People Day. These are events that are meant to remember those who didn't make it home and honor those who are here today. And so this is what we try to encourage everyone to do. And I want to thank you all again for taking the time to welcome me here today.